So today I'm going to be, the major part of this will be talking about the seal judgments, which are in Revelation chapter 6. And Revelation chapter 6 talks about the first six seals, and then there's an interlude, chapter 7, where there's two visions, and then chapter 8 picks up with the seventh seal. So we'll basically be looking at chapter 6 today in Revelation, and my purpose is to point out the similarities between the seal judgments and the Olivet Discourse, which is Jesus's uh, announcement, and warning of coming judgment on Jerusalem, which was going to happen in that first century generation and took place in 70 AD. And in his Olivet Discourse, he gives kind of some summary statements about what some of the things that are going to happen during that period of time, which ultimately ends with the destruction of Jerusalem. And all interpreters that I've consulted, and this would be any interpreter from all of the different eschatological views. So we're talking, dispensationalists and historical premill and amill and preterist, and so all your futurists and all your non-futurists, everybody agrees that the Olivet Discourse and Revelation 6 are in some sense parallel, and we're going to be looking at that, kind of pointing out how they're parallel, and then I'm going to be making some suggestions about what the parallelism probably means or could mean. But before we get to Revelation 6, I want to kind of give a summary of Revelation 1 through 5, so that we know what's going on in the overall presentation of the Revelation. So in Revelation 1, you have the vision of Christ. You have the introduction at the beginning, and then followed by the vision of Christ walking among the candlestands, right? Walking on the lampstands. And that's explained as Christ being with his people and walking among them, holding them in his hand, holding the leaders of those churches or the angels of the churches in his hands. And so that's a vision of comfort and of the presence of Christ among his people. And the seven lampstands that he's walking among are identified as the seven churches who are addressed in Revelation chapter 1, and then who receive particular letters from Christ in chapters 2 and 3. So chapter 1 is the introduction with the introductory vision of comfort and presence. Chapters 2 and 3 are letters from Christ to each of the seven churches, so one letter each. And the letters themselves follow kind of a geographical postal route around that part of the world, starting with the one closest to Jerusalem, basically, and then going up and around and back. So it's kind of a circuit. And what the letters contain are messages from Christ where he affirms his presence with his people. He evaluates the conditions of each of the churches. He points out things that they're doing well and commends them for it. And he points out things where they need to do better and areas where they are struggling. And he promises to be with them in their struggle. But he also says that if they don't, some of the problems are so bad that if they are not corrected, he will come back and there'll be some form of judgment against that church, either against the leaders of the church, the Christians in the church, the heretics in the church, or in one case, the church itself, the lampstand will be removed. So there's the personal type of one personal aspect to the letters, and then there's another level of what's going on in the letters, and that is generally for the entire Christian community, because all of these letters are meant to be read by each of the Christian communities. What Jesus is doing is saying there's tough times coming. Something is on the horizon that he calls, that John calls tribulation, and John says he's actually already in it, and that things are going to get worse. And as you read through the Revelation, you see that the visions kind of show that things are going to get worse. And in the letters, what Jesus is doing is he's preparing his people so that their faith will endure. So he's saying, This is what you need to do so that you can stand strong in that day, in that period of time when things are rough, because things are getting rough now, but they're not as bad as they're going to be. So he's preparing his people. So that brings us to chapter 4 and 5. Chapter 4 and 5 are one vision in two parts. One vision in two parts. And this happens, one vision in two parts, things happens a couple of times in the Revelation. So chapter 4 and 5 cover the vision in the heavenly throne room. In the first part, chapter 4, is a vision of God, and we would take it to be God the Father on the throne, and he's being worshipped by pretty much all of creation. And the reason he's being worshipped in Revelation 4 is because he is worthy. I'm just going to read Revelation 4:11. You are worthy, our Lord and God, to receive glory and power and honor, for you created all things, and by your will they were created and have their being. What that means is that God is being praised for being the creator and sustainer, or of all the creation. And so this first vision is God, the first part of the vision is God on the throne, being worshipped for being creator and sustainer. The second part of the vision is about the Lamb. And this is going to end with a similar praise for the Lamb. But before I read the praise there, what happens in the vision is there's a 7-sealed scroll, and I think we'll just read it. So Revelation 5, just read that, because this will introduce the 7-sealed scroll that is being opened in chapter 6. Then I saw on the right hand of him who sat on the throne a scroll with writing on both sides and sealed with 7 seals. And I saw a mighty angel proclaiming in a loud voice, "Who is worthy to break the seals and open the scroll?" But no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth could open the scroll or even look inside it. I wept and wept because no one was found who was worthy to open the scroll or to look inside. So there's nobody in all of creation that is worthy to open the scroll. And John is very upset about this. This is it is basically worldview destroying information that there's nobody worthy to open the scroll. All of the foundations of his belief are of his understanding are shaken here. It's going to turn out that the scroll is the authority to rule over God's people and God's creation, and the authority to administer the outworking of that kingdom. And as the scroll is opened in chapter 6, the picture is that the person who's able to open the scroll and receive the scroll, that he's the only one who is worthy to make these events that have to do with the coming of the kingdom, unfold, because he is the king. So to receive the scroll means you're worthy of administering the contents of the scroll, right? And in this case, it's the kingdom. So verse 5, then one of the elders said to me, "Do not weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has triumphed. He is able to open the scroll and its 7 seals." So we know who this is. This is Jesus. These are messianic prophecies, messianic titles, and he has triumphed. So this is an ascension vision. And the reason I say that is because what's just happened is the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, he's triumphed. He's overcome the challenge to himself. He has done the thing that God has sent him to do. So he's now accomplished the redemption of his people. And now he's entered into this heavenly courtroom. And so if you remember back to Daniel 7, that's exactly what happens in Daniel 7, with the Son of Man coming with clouds up into the heavenly courtroom. And he's presented before the Ancient of Days. And he is then given a kingdom and a people that will endure forever. And that's what happens in Daniel 7. This passage in Revelation 5 is another way of saying what happened in Daniel 7. It's a parallel passage. Verse 6, then I saw a lamb looking as if it had been slain, standing at the center of the throne, encircled by the 4 living creatures and the elders. The lamb had 7 horns, and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. He went and took the scroll from the right hand of him who sat on the throne. And when he had taken it, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb. Each one had a harp, and they were holding golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of God's people. And we sang a new song. Let me just mention this, the prayers of God's people. This comes up again at the end in Revelation 8, at the end of the seals. So this, you can effectively say this is the beginning of the sealed judgments, because you have the 7 sealed scroll here. And at the beginning, we have this reference to the prayers of God's people, and again at the end in chapter 8. And if we have time, we'll look at that. There's a reference to the prayers of God's people. But in chapter 8, it's very, very clear that the contents of the scroll, the opening up of the scroll, which basically brings judgment upon the oppressors of God's people, is in response to the prayers of God's people. And so the fact that there was nobody worthy to open the scroll to John means our prayers won't be answered. There's no help for us, type of thing. So that's why it was so terrible. And so the Lamb receives the scroll, and in fact he takes the scroll. It's an interesting thing. He's not given the scroll. That's implied, but he takes the scroll, right? He takes the scroll, and now he has the scroll. And then there's an outbreak of great praise. And so verse 9, and they sang a new song, saying, "You are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, because you were slain, and with your blood you purchased for God persons from every tribe and language and people and nation." That phrase is from the book of Daniel. So it brings you back into Daniel. It's the parallel again. "You have made them to be a kingdom and priests to serve our God, and they will reign on the earth." So again, the Lamb receives the scroll, and he's worthy to open it. And the reason is because he's accomplished the work of redemption. So we have God being praised for creator and sustainer, and now the Lamb being praised for the work of redemption. And he's given the scroll, signifying that he has received all this authority and people and a kingdom. He's making them into a kingdom. So verse 11, "Then I looked and heard the voice of many angels, numbering thousands upon thousands and 10,000 times 10,000. And they encircled the throne and the living creatures and the elders. In a loud voice they were saying, 'Worthy is the Lamb who was slain, to receive power and wealth and wisdom and strength and honor and glory and praise.'" So we have escalating circles of praise here. You start out with the elders and the 24 elders and the 4 living creatures, and they praise. And now it's thousands and thousands and 10,000s of angels around the throne, and they're praising. And they're praising the Lamb, because he is worthy to receive all this power and authority and glory. And actually, there are 7 attributes there, which is a number that is significant, right, in the Revelation. Verse 13, "Then I heard every creature." Now it's expanded again. We just have this escalating praise. "Every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth and on the sea and all that is in them, saying, 'To him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be praise and honor and glory and power forever and ever.' And the 4 living creatures said, 'Amen.' And the elders fell down and worshipped." And so then it starts all over, with the elders and the living creatures. So we have this vision of the chapter 5. This is actually the central vision in the Revelation. What I mean by saying that is that all of the subsequent events and visions and everything that happens in the Revelation from now on comes from the opening of the scroll. And so the receiving of the scroll and the reason why he receives the scroll are central to the Revelation. And for God's people, this means that those scary things that are coming out, that are being envisioned by the things that are coming out of the scroll, are actually in the hands of our loving Lord, who gave himself for us. And they're coming from him. And so I have nothing to be afraid of. And I can trust him for all things, because he not only walks among the candlestands and he's with me in my particular situation, but he actually has all of this in his hands too. There's nothing here to be afraid of. He is worthy of all honor and praise, and I'm not to be afraid of and give any fear to anything else. And so to God's people, it's a comforting vision that starts off. And I think when most people read the Revelation, they forget that. They go right to the visions, and they start reading the scary stuff, and they get scared. But that's not the right response. The right response is to say, this is coming from the hands of the Lord, who's received the kingdom and who controls all things for the good of his people.
Mm.
Right? So that's a really important point there.
I mean, if you could summarize Revelation in 2 words, it's God wins, right?
Yeah, God wins. God wins. And it isn't a struggle, really. It's not God against anybody else. It's God outworking his kingdom. That's what the other significance of the scroll is. The scroll contains, you might say it like this, the scroll contains the rest of human history until the consummation. And that's all in the hands of the Lord. There is no alternate plan that he's fighting against. Right? It's not really even a struggle. He's working out his will. And so when you look at it from that point of view and you say, well, look at that, he's, we sing the song, he's got the whole world in his hands. That's what this means. Okay. So
does it make sense to even ask, like, chronologically when this is happening? I mean, it seems obvious that it's after the resurrection and ascension, right? Because he's worthy to do that. But is it, make sense to understand this as in, like, okay, it was somewhat immediately after the ascension, or, right before the final judgment? Is it like the opening of the seals, and once they're all opened is then when final judgment, or the 7th seal is final judgment? Do we need to worry too much about, like, chronologically where we are here?
I don't think that we do. I think that in some eschatological views, they're very, very interested in that. Dispensationalism is really, really interested in where are we on the timeline, right? But they're the only ones that have that point of view, where it's necessary for them to know where we are on the timeline. So obviously, from an idealist point of view, you would say, well, what the seals show us, what the rest of the revelation shows us, is there's going to be difficult times, but God is in control and Christ is on the throne, and so we can trust him, and God's people will be persecuted, and there will be anti-Christian governments and things like that, but God will deal with them in his time, and we need to trust him for that. And so they look at it as, principle, and they're repeated over and over again. So there's actually no chronology, right? There's no actual chronology. A preterist or a partial preterist is going to say, well, these are, and this is one of the implications that I'm going to draw from the Olivet Discourse parallels, is that these seals are paralleled in the Olivet Discourse, and the Olivet Discourse is about the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And so we're over that. These aren't going to happen again. And so then there's that, right? And so then the 7th seal in the preterist view becomes not the final coming of Christ in, the bodily presence of, or bodily coming of Christ at the end of history, but it becomes the judgment coming of Christ in 70 AD, right? And then you've got views like, you've got some views that kind of mix that, right? And they'll go, well, yes, it is about Jerusalem, or at least the Olivet Discourse is, and this is similar to that. It has lots of parallels with the Olivet Discourse, but that's just because God does the same thing again. He's doing it again, and this has to do, more with the times leading up to the second coming. So maybe a historical premillennialist will do that, but then again, they don't know. They're not so obsessed with time indicators, because they realize that there's nothing really specific here. There's going to be wars and rumors of wars. There'll be famines and pestilence. The church will be persecuted, right? It's not really a specific prediction. So then, I think there's nothing really to be worried about. And the other reason I don't think that, as far as worried about where we are in the timeline, or concerned with, I guess, about that, And I think that another reason, and a really significant one for not being particularly concerned about trying to find out where we are on the timeline, if this is a timeline, is because Jesus did not give these visions to the first century church so that they could write out a calendar.
Mm.
Right? He gave them these visions so that they would know the seriousness of what they would be facing, so that they could be prepared and not lose their faith when it happened. And when Jesus says, "Look, you're going to suffer. See, I told you beforehand." Right? It's that type of thing.
Mm.
It's not the, "Oh, look what just happened in the Middle East, and now I can see what the next thing is going to be." They were not detached from these situations. They were in these situations. So they had a completely different meaning for them than somebody watching from half a world away.
Mm.
Right. So let's look at the seven seals. And if you've got that document that I sent you, because we're not going to be able to actually read the Olivet Discourse alongside the seven seals, but the Olivet Discourse was Jesus's pronouncement about the fall of Jerusalem in 70, which is coming and happened in 70 AD. He never said 70 AD, but he said this generation. So I want to look at the parallels. So the seven seals start out with, "Now I watched when the Lamb opened one of the seven seals, and I heard one of the four living creatures say with a voice like thunder, 'Come.' And I looked, and behold, a white horse, and its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer." So all interpreters believe that this has something to do with Christ. It's either Christ or Antichrist, or Christ or false Christ. And the reason that they believe it's Christ is because he's on a white horse, and he's riding a white horse. And in chapter 19, we have a vision of Christ riding a white horse. And so the two images are thought to be speaking, basically Christ, or 19 definitely is Christ. Chapter 6 here, not sure, not 100% agreement. If it is Antichrist or false Christ rather than Christ, and one of the arguments for it being Antichrist and not Christ is that the other visions are basically negative, and so they're about things that are coming that are not pleasant. And so this is perhaps this is false Christs and false prophets, or Antichrist. And if that is the case, then it's parallel with, I'll just pick one, Matthew 24, 4 and 5. And Jesus answered them, "See that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and they will lead many astray." He's answering their question about when are these things going to happen, the destruction of the temple, basically. When will the temple be destroyed? And he says, well, people are going to come and say that they're me, but don't follow them. Right? And then wars and rumors of wars is the next thing, and that's following in Revelation 6. The very next verse is verse 3. "When he opened the second seal, I heard a second living creature say, 'Come,' and out came another horse, bright red. This rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that people should slay one another, and he was given a great sword." All right, red horse, blood color. He's given a sword so people can slay each other. He's taking peace from the earth. This is war. Okay. Luke 21, 9 and 10. "And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, and when you hear of wars and tumults, do not be terrified, for these things must first take place, but the end will not be at once. Then he said to them, nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom." So we have this parallel. And again, one of the things about the parallels that I want to point out is that they are actually even in the same order. They're going to be in the same order all the way through. So Revelation 6, verse 5 and 6. Third seal. "When he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, 'Come.' And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and its rider had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, 'A quart of wheat for a denarius.'" So that's 1 day's worth of earning. and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine. All right, so it's famine, and that's, everybody agrees. This is famine, and it says I got earthquakes listed there. Okay. Earthquakes are listed in the Olivet Discourse, not listed here. So Olivet Discourse, now we'll read Mark 13:8. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. These are but the beginning of the birth pains. So we got famine here are the same. No earthquakes listed in Revelation. Pestilence. Revelation 6:7. When he opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a pale horse. Its rider's name was Death. Hades followed him. They were given authority over the 4th of the earth to kill with sword and famine and pestilence, and by wild beasts of the earth. So pestilence is the thing that's added here. Wild beasts are also added here. Wild beasts are not mentioned in the Olivet Discourse. So we have, but pestilences are in the Luke 21:11 passage. It says, and then that whole passage is, there will be great earthquakes in various places, famines and pestilences. So we have the triad there, which is showing up here again. Followed by persecution. When he opened the 5th seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the witness they had borne. They cried out with a loud voice, "O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you will judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth?" And then they were each given a white robe and told to rest a little longer until the number of their fellow servants and brothers should be complete, who were to be killed as they themselves had been. So we have martyrdom and we have persecution going on because there's brothers and sisters who have not been killed yet who are being persecuted. And you have future martyrdom, right? The promise of future martyrdom. So let's read maybe the longest one, which is Mark 13:9 and following. Be on your guard, for they will deliver you over to councils, and you will be beaten in synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings for my sake to bear witness before them. And the gospel must first be proclaimed to all nations. And when they bring you to trial and deliver you over, do not be anxious beforehand what you are to say. Say what is given to you in that hour, for it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. And brother will deliver brother over to death, and the father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. That's the whole point of him telling them what's going on. Endure to the end. What's going to go on. Anyway, so you have all of these signs or events or things that Jesus has mentioned, both in the Olivet Discourse and now again in the seals, which are happening in succession. And so it seems like there's a pretty strong parallelism. To continue in Revelation 6, verse 12, when he opened the 6th seal, I looked, and behold, there was a great earthquake. There's your earthquake. And the sun became black as sackcloth, and the full moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth as the fig tree sheds its winter fruit when shaken by a gale. The sky vanished like a scroll that is being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. So we call at least the things happening in the sky, astral or heavenly phenomena. That's the term that's used. And again, we'll look at Luke for that, even though the other ones say it, but Luke has more detail. And there will be terrors and great signs from heaven. That's verse 11. And then Luke 21:25. And there will be signs in sun and moon and stars, and on the earth distress of nations and perplexity because of the roaring of the sea and the waves, people fainting with fear and with foreboding of what is coming on the world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. So Jesus mentions astral phenomenon in both of these places. Again, and let me read Matthew 24:29. Gives a little bit different detail. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And this is all then repeated in the Revelation, with in a little bit different way, with a little more, some other details that are not included. To continue in Revelation, verse 15, then the kings of the earth and the great ones and the generals and the rich and the powerful and everyone, slave and free, hid themselves in the caves among the rocks and among the rocks of the mountains, calling to the rocks and the mountains, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of their wrath is come, and who can stand? So we have the day of the Lamb, the wrath. It's the day of the Son of Man. And we have then in Matthew, then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. It sounds a little bit different. Then they Mark 13:26, they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And then Luke, and they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. And then Jesus talks about the same thing a little bit later in Luke 23. As the soldiers led him away, they seized Simon from Cyrene, who was on his way in from the country, and put the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A large number of people followed him, including women who mourned and wailed for him. Jesus turned and said to them, daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children, for the time will come when you will say, blessed are the childless women, the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed. And then they will say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if people do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry? What I just read there from Luke 23 is thought, I think, by at least the majority, if not all commentators, to be Jesus talking about the great and terrible things going to happen in the siege of Jerusalem, where it's actually recorded by Josephus, who was eyewitness to these events, that people were lamenting that they thought it would be better if they didn't have children, because the famine was so bad and so many people were dying. It was so bad that there's at least one instance that Josephus records specifically with great detail of a woman boiling her child and eating it. And so when they say, blessed are those who have no children, that's probably what the reference is. And Jesus says at that time, they're going to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. But that's what they say in Revelation 6. Revelation 6, 15 and 16, they hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains, calling to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne. So those are the basic parallels that they seem to be obvious, and I there is some it doesn't seem to bother commentators. I guess I'll say it like this: it doesn't seem to bother the commentators who notice the parallels, which is everybody, that so I have famines and earthquakes in number 3, but actually in the Revelation passage there's no earthquake, right? So it's famines, and later on an earthquake is mentioned, but it's not plural. So that there are a couple of discrepancies, maybe 2 discrepancies among the parallelism that might cause you to think, nah, I'm not so sure that these are talking about the same thing, right? For my part, I don't like that there are those discrepancies. Like, I don't like that there's not agreement on the rider on the white horse. And I wish that in Revelation 6 there was an earthquakes were mentioned. That I would, but I know that the fact that something is not mentioned doesn't mean it's not there, right? I'm not going to import it into the text. I don't want to do that, but it's this thing about how many angels were at the tomb, 1 or 2, because this gospel says 1 and this one says 2. Well, the gospel that says 1 does not say only 1. It just says there was an angel. It doesn't say that there was only 1 angel. So, we're not excluding the fact that there were 2 angels by just focusing on 1. So famines and earthquakes, I don't like it, but it doesn't really particularly bother me that earthquakes aren't there. Rider on the white horse, I am attracted to views that say Christ is the conqueror, so I like the view that says Christ is the rider on the white horse here. He's the conqueror. But I know that I'm attracted to views that say that, and so I'm giving weight to that. That's probably undue. So I don't have an objection there. And so what it seems when you read through it is, when you compare the two, is that not only are there several parallels, but that the parallels are all in the same order, and you might be able to explain that order, by looking at, well, how does the siege progress? But that would only account for things like famine and pestilence and stuff like that, but it doesn't account for the astral language, the astral phenomena, and things like that. And it wouldn't account for earthquakes or false Christs. Those don't happen in a famine either, or in a siege. So anyway, so I've already expressed what my understanding is. My understanding is that the reason that they're parallel is because in the Revelation, what's happening is this is an expansion of the Olivet Discourse, and it's the Olivet Discourse in a visionary way instead of, and then what that means is that the seals are about the fall of Jerusalem, and that can easily be substantiated because we've already looked at passages like in Revelation 11 where it says, this is this figuratively called Sodom and Gomorrah, where their Lord was crucified, and that's the city being judged, and that would be Jerusalem. So it seems to make sense there. The other thing I want to mention about the Olivet Discourse, so it's only recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's not in John. It's not in John. And so some commentators who notice that say, well, perhaps in the Revelation, this is John's recording of the Olivet Discourse, because it's not recorded in the other places. So anyway, any initial thoughts or comments about that? I guess while you're thinking about your thoughts, I want to say this, that every commentator believes that the Olivet Discourse and the book of Revelation are connected, obviously, because they believe that these passages are connected in somehow, and that either the Revelation is a different presentation of the Olivet Discourse, or that the things that happened in the Olivet Discourse are going to be repeated, in some other. And those are the only two options, really. And so if you're trying to figure out how they're related, you're just kind of locked into they're about the same thing, specifically the fall of Jerusalem, or they're about the same things generally, which generally happen in this order. So, but there's an obvious parallelism.
So I guess I don't have a question necessarily about this. It's pretty, it's pretty straightforward, and obviously it's something that we have to incorporate into the overall sense we're making of things here, and it's an important parallel. So I don't know if I'm jumping ahead, but in terms of Matthew 24 and Matthew 25, I mean, the way my Bible labels those is 24 is about the destruction of the temple, and then 25 is about the final judgment.
Yes. And that's, yeah. So what do you think about that? Do you have any thoughts about that, or you just wanted to hear my opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely wanted to just get an understanding of, because I know these headings are not inspired, and so but apparently it seems to be generally accepted enough that this is how they're labeled. So I mean, is that at all controversial, or?
It is. There is a minority view that says there are two minority views that say Matthew 24 and 25 are all about the destruction of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
That's one minority view. And the other minority view, if you can guess it, is
Yeah.
that
They're all about the final judgment. Yeah.
Right. So the rule for what views have been held in church history and what views are currently held is this: whatever view you can if you think of all the possibilities, what are all the possible views that could be held? You got two things, and so there's a limited number, a finite number.
Yeah, sure.
And you're asking about how are they related, right? So you have a finite number of possible views. Somebody holds one of those views.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
And then I guess a little more specifically, from what I understand of the partial preterist view, is that a lot of what we see here is has already been fulfilled, but there are some things. Obviously, the final judgment. There's certain things that are yet to be fulfilled, or the final judgment is obviously yet to be fulfilled, but that there are also some of these signs that have to happen before the final judgment can happen, right?
Right.
And so I guess what I'm thinking
yeah.
Okay. And I guess so maybe this is my misunderstanding, but I thought from like a partial preterist viewpoint that the spreading of the gospel to the world was one of those things that is said to not have been accomplished yet.
Okay, right. So two things there. So there is that view you mentioned where people say, well, these same things are some of them are not fulfilled yet, or
Yeah.
maybe they're all fulfilled, but they're going to be fulfilled again, type of thing. You got a double fulfillment.
Mhm.
One view is double fulfillment, and the other view is this hasn't been fulfilled, and so it still needs to be. So to say something about the double fulfillment view, as far as I understand the double fulfillment view, and I've done substantial reading on people who believe the double fulfillment view, there's nothing in the Bible that would indicate that. There's actually nothing in the text that indicates that you're supposed to look for two or more fulfillments. And if there were, then let's say there is something secret there that, in Matthew 24 and 25 that gives us reason to think that it's going to be fulfilled again. Well, how do we know that it's only 2 times? Maybe it's 300 times. I mean, it's completely arbitrary to say double fulfillment, right? So, I totally discount that view. I don't think that view has any merit at all. The double fulfillment one. As to the view as the partial preterist view, or the view that says Matthew 24:14, right? In this gospel, the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come.
Yeah.
So there's an assumption made there that end is end of the world. But if Jesus is talking about the fall of Jerusalem and the end of the things I'm talking about in my prophecy, then the end has a different reference than
Right.
the end of the world. But the more important one is that you can go to passages. I'm not sure if we looked at these passages before, but like Colossians chapter 1, if you were to look at Colossians 1:6, Paul says that the gospel was preached to every nation and in the whole world. And then in Colossians 1:23, I believe he says that it was preached to every creature under heaven, which seems even more extensive, And you have the same thing in Romans 10 and in a couple of other places where Paul, by the mid-50s, is using this language that says that he believes he's not using hyperbole. He says it's being brought to the whole world. It's the gospel presently, and your faith is being spoken of in the whole world. Obviously,
Right.
That means the gospel's been, and so then what you have to do is think about you have to think about a couple of things. What does Paul mean by world? Right, and you also have to think, does the Holy Spirit know what Jesus said here in Matthew 24? And obviously the answer is yes.
Yeah.
And given that the Holy Spirit knows what Jesus said in Matthew 24, are Paul's statements comments on this passage. And I think that's a legitimate assumption.
Yeah.
And so and I think that's way more legitimate than saying, no, even though there's 6 verbal similarities between these two passages and the subject is the same subject, they have nothing to do with each other. I think that is unreasonable.
Right.
So
Yeah.
if the most reasonable course of interpretation is to say that what Paul says there in Colossians and Romans and in the other places is actually linked to this statement of Jesus in Matthew 24:14, then what Paul is explicitly saying is that the conditions have been met for.
Right. So I guess
Yeah.
my question was, is that if that's a misunderstanding on my part to say that a partial preterist would hold out the preaching of the gospel to all the nations, that they're saying that that's already done, right?
They're saying that, well, okay, so I guess maybe this will be helpful. So you have this passage, which Paul is commenting on this passage, but you also have Matthew 28, the Great Commission, right?
Yeah.
And partial preterists don't think the Great Commission has been fulfilled. Nobody in the church thinks that's been fulfilled yet. The gospel has to go out, but notice the difference, right? So you remember the Great Commission, right? It's preach the gospel to all nations, make disciples of all nations, teach everybody what I commanded you, and lo, I am with you always, right? So it's about discipleship, right? It's about actually making converts. And so the Great Commission, the focus of the spreading of the gospel is the expansion of the church. But what's the focus here? Verse 14, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Isn't this the same as when Jesus said, well, and actually in the parallel passage, he said, you'll be brought before governors and kings as a witness, as a testimony, to give them a testimony, right? And so it was a defensive thing. It wasn't an evangelistic, expanding the kingdom type of thing. It's part of the persecution.
Yeah.
Right. And in fact, when you look at the paragraph here, it's part of the persecution, right? There's going to be false prophets, and people are going to, their love's going to grow cold, and you're going to be hated by all nations. And as a result of that, you're going to give a testimony before all the nations, because they're going to yank you into their court.
Right.
So
that, I guess that clarifies a little bit. I'll have to digest it a little bit, but that does clarify. Because the other thing I was thinking too is that, especially if you're thinking, well, let's consider what of this has been, this was to a first century audience. What was fulfilled in the first century? To say that a testimony to all the nations, well, that would be all the nations that existed at that time. But that doesn't mean that when we go this Great Commission that, hey, we're still commanded to do. Like, I don't have to say, well, all of the first century nations have already been preached to, so we're done here, right? It continues. That part continues. But that's the Great Commission, and this is, the testimony that was called for here in the first century.
Right, and it was actually legal testimony, right? It's actually in a legal context when you read the parallels, and even this paragraph indicates that they're actually brought into a court, and they're said defend yourself, and they give a testimony, and so that it's a legal term, and that it's actually. I'm glad that you brought this up and that we got to this point in the conversation, because if you were to do a search through the Revelation on all of the words related to testimony, this word testimony, the root word of this word is martyr, and so which means witness. It comes up a lot in the book of Acts too. It is a main word in the Revelation. They are giving testimonies. They were persecuted for their faith in the testimony of Jesus Christ. They persevered by the word of their faith and the testimony of Jesus Christ. It's a legal word, and so you have martyrs, martyrdom, testimony, witness, all these things.
Right.
Pervasive.
Yeah, there's definitely in Revelation, there's definitely this focus on the martyrs, right?
Right. Yeah. So you have this So, right, and Jesus predicts all of that in his Olivet Discourse, and then also again makes reference to it in the seal judgment. And the witness to the nations happens uh, sometime during that 1,000 years, but that 1,000 years indicates a long period of time that the first century church is not. I mean, they're just barely beginning. They're at the
Right.
they're at the birth pains part, right? The birth pains of the kingdom of Christ, and so
Mm.
they're experiencing the end of the old age, signified by Jerusalem and the temple, and the beginning of the new age. But the 1,000 years, at the end of the 1,000 years, you got the final judgment, and then the nations have already brought in their treasures, and that happens because the rider on the white horse is going out with the sword of his word, conquering the nations.
Mm.
And he does that for the 1,000 years.
Right.
But so that's kind of how the big chunks that we haven't talked about yet, that's kind of how they fit in. And
Yeah, I figured I was sort of getting ahead of things here, but I just wanted to, I guess, get the framework in mind.
Right. So the basic question from today that everybody who's responsible in their reading of the Bible has to address is, what's the relationship between the Olivet Discourse and the Book of Revelation? You really, that'll be one of the, whatever you think about that will determine, or I'll say this, it will eliminate some eschatologies. If you think they're talking about the same thing, then you're not a futurist. If you think that one's talking about the fall of Jerusalem and the other one is talking about the end of history, then you're a futurist. So you put yourself in one of these camps by answering this question, how they're related. And so you still might end up being an amillennialist or an idealist, and that's totally fine. But this is one of those watershed issues where you see the parallelisms. What do they mean? What's the significance of it? So you have to think through that, or at least put it in the back of your head. So when you're reading the rest of the Revelation, you go, okay, now I know there's these parallelisms, and how does this fit in? So let's look real quick at the seventh seal, which is Revelation 8. So like I said, Revelation 7 is part of the seal sequence, but it's not one of the seals. So we're not going to, we might spend 2 minutes on that later. But so the seventh seal is Revelation 8, verses 1 through 5. When he opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. So that's a reference to a passage in the Old Testament where, and you probably have a note in your Bible that says go there, but where the earth is, where the Lord is on his throne, and basically it's a judgment setting. Lord's going to judge. Let all the earth be silent before him. And so when he opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour, and I saw the 7 angels who stood before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. Another angel who had a golden censer came and stood at the altar. He was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all God's people on the golden altar in front of the throne. So we've already run into the censer and the prayers of God's people in chapter 5. The smoke of the incense, together with the prayers of God's people, went up before God from the angel's hand. Then the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and hurled it on the earth. And there came peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. And we also had that repeated. So the picture here is that the angel is standing before God's throne, and he's got the incense, and the aroma and the smoke were rising, which represents the prayers of the saints. And that God, sitting on his highly exalted throne, the prayers arise to God, and the response to the prayers is to take fire from the altar, which represents judgment, and throw it on the earth. And that picture comes from Ezekiel. If we've got, you guys have a little bit more time, 10 minutes?
I think so.
So let's look at So just so you get the picture, but anyway, this is how the seal judgments ends, and you notice that the seal judgments kind of end, but then the trumpet judgments start right up. Even there's an overlap here between them because the seven angels are given seven trumpets in verse 2,
Yeah.
and then in verse 6, the seven angels who had the seven trumpets prepare to sound them. And then the first angel sounds his trumpet, etc. So you have three series of seven judgments that they kind of, at least the first two, explicitly dovetail together, so that the two ways to explain that is that they're chronological or they're not chronological, right? Um, in other words, there's a series of seven followed by another series of seven in the literature, but chronologically they're more like this, parallel. Okay. Or they're actually chronological. And if they're actually chronological, then you cannot have the seventh seal being the end of the world, obviously. So if you, so anyway, if you think it's about the end of the world, you have to make them parallel. I guess you would have to say that. Or else you keep getting to the, you keep ending the world. It ends multiple times in the Revelation. So that's what idealists do. Idealists will go, these are parallel. All the series of judgments are parallel. They all have the same end. So when we read about in chapter 6 of the sixth seal and the stars falling and things like that, that's deconstruction language, meaning there's a new king in town. It's used from the Old Testament. It's not about the literal universe being destroyed, and I know that because of the language being used, but I also know that because it's the sixth in the series of seven. It is not the seventh. The seventh one is where you expect the final culmination, the judgment, all that. So even if the seventh represents the total destruction of the universe, the sixth seal cannot represent that. Right.
Yeah, at best, it's like the defeat of the principalities and powers.
Right, exactly. So it's not about the dissolution of the universe. The stars literally are not falling. They're literally not literally falling. Anyway, and that's Old Testament language. And if you need at least, you can look at Isaiah 13 and just read that and see about the language. Isaiah 13 and 19.
Sort of end of age type
Yeah.
language, right?
End of age stuff. Yeah. So let's look at Ezekiel. I think we want to look at Ezekiel 9 and 10 and 11. Let's see, Ezekiel. Let's see. I'm looking for the exact reference. Okay. So we'll go to chapter 10 right now. And
it's interesting scanning through. I see mark on foreheads. I mean, that's interesting.
Oh yeah, we'll get back to there in a minute. we haven't really talked about the sealing of the 144,000, which was Revelation 7. Right now, I just want to show the reference to the fire from the altar.
Yeah.
So Ezekiel 10 verse 1, I looked and I saw the likeness of a throne of lapis lazuli, however you say that, lazuli, above the vault that was over the heads of the cherubim. So it's a vision of the Lord's throne, and the Lord said to the man clothed in linen, go in among the wheels beneath the cherubim and fill your hands with burning coals from among the cherubim and scatter them over the city. And as I watched, he went in. This is a judgment image, and we'll back up and read chapter 9 in a minute to see that. Now the cherubim were standing on the south side of the temple when the man went in, and a cloud filled the inner court. And the glory of the Lord rose from above the cherubim and moved to the threshold of the temple. What you want to notice is the language of motion, right? You want to see that the Lord, who has been seated above the cherubim in the temple in the Holy of Holies, has now moved. Now he's been there for a long time. He was there in the tabernacle. Now he's there in the temple. This is toward the end of the life of the temple. The Lord is going to now start his movement. And by the end of Ezekiel 11, the Lord has actually moved out of Jerusalem. He's abandoned the city because he's given it over to destruction. That's what the vision is. So then, verse 4, then the glory of the Lord rose from above the cherubim and moved to the threshold of the temple. So he's on his way out. The cloud filled the temple, and the court was full of the radiance of the glory of the Lord. Now he's in the court. He's not even in the building anymore. He's in the court. The sound of the wings of the cherubim could be heard as far away as the outer court, like the voice of God Almighty when he speaks. When the Lord commanded the man in linen, take fire from among the wheels, from among the cherubim, the man went in and stood beside a wheel. Then one of the cherubim reached out his hand to the fire that was among them. He took up some of it and put it in the hands of the man in linen. He took it and went out. Under the wings of the cherubim could be seen what looked like human hands. I looked and I saw beside the cherubim 4 wheels, one beside each of the cherubim. The wheels sparkled like topaz. As for their appearance, the 4 of them looked alike. Each was like a wheel and intersecting a wheel. And as they moved, they would go in any one of the 4 directions the cherubim faced. And the wheels did not turn about as the cherubim went. The cherubim went in whatever direction the head faced without turning as they went. Their entire bodies, including their backs, their hands, and their wings, were completely full of eyes, as were the 4 wheels. I heard the wheels being called the whirling wheels. Each of the cherubim had 4 faces. One face was that of a cherub, the second face of a human being, the third face of a lion, and the fourth the face of an eagle. Then the cherubim rose upward. These were the living creatures I had seen by the Kibar River. He's referring to Ezekiel 1. When the cherubim moved, the wheels beside them moved. Now this is God's mobile throne is moving now. And when the cherubim spread their wings to rise from the ground, the wheels did not leave their side. When the cherubim stood still, they stood still. Also, and when the cherubim rose, they rose with them, because the spirit of the living creatures was in them. Then the glory of the Lord departed from over the threshold of the temple and stopped above the cherubim. While I watched, the cherubim spread their wings and rose from the ground, and as they went, the wheels went with them, and they stopped at the entrance of the east gate of the Lord's house, and the glory of the God of Israel was above them. Terrifying. God's presence is leaving the temple. At the end of chapter 11, he's gone. He goes up to the Mount of Olives outside of Jerusalem, goes to the Mount of Olives and looks down on from the Mount of Olives on Jerusalem, which has now been condemned to destruction because the Lord has abandoned it. And that's the picture that is meant with taking the coals from the altar and throwing it on the city. This fire of judgment from God coming on the city. This is the destruction of Jerusalem in 586. This is what happens a few years later in 586. And this vision is being reused in Revelation. And I think is being reused to talk about the destruction of Jerusalem again in 70. Let's look at chapter 9, Ezekiel. So what's preceded in this is God has been instructing Ezekiel about how idolatrous, and it's even worse than Ezekiel thought, the idolatry, and he thought it was really bad and God should judge. But God says, well, it's not quite as bad as you thought. Let me tell you how bad it really is. And how the idolatry has made it all the way up into the priesthood, and that they are totally anti-God. In secret, they're burning incense and worshiping other gods inside the temple and stuff like that. And it's just really awful. And so God's going to judge Jerusalem and the temple because the leadership and the people are so perverted in their following of him. So chapter 9, then I heard him call out in a loud voice, bring near those who are appointed to execute judgment on the city, each with a weapon in his hand. And I saw 6 men coming from the direction of the upper gate, which faces north, each with a deadly weapon in his hand. With them was a man clothed in linen. So we read about him in chapter 10, who had a writing kit at his side. He came in and it stood beside the bronze altar. Now the glory of the God of Israel went up from above the cherubim where it had been and moved to the threshold of the temple. Then the Lord called to the man. Wait, did I just? Oh, yeah. So this is very similar to how chapter 10 starts, right? I was like, did I already read this? Then the Lord called to the man clothed in linen who had the writing kit at his side and said to him, go throughout the city of Jerusalem and put a mark on the foreheads of those who grieve and lament over all the detestable things that are done in it. Okay, so he's going to go through and he's going to mark, on the forehead. And just to mention it, the word for mark there in the ancient Hebrew language was one letter. It was the tau, and the tau looks like this. Looks like a cross. So go and put a cross on their forehead, basically, of those who grieve and lament over all the detestable things that are done in it. So on the believers, mark them. As I listened, he said to the others, follow him through the city and kill, and without showing pity or compassion. Slaughter the old men, the young men and women, the mothers and children, but do not touch anyone who has the mark. Begin at my sanctuary. So they began with the old men who were in front of the temple. Then he says, defile the temple with the slain, pile up the bodies, that kind of thing. So anyway, so in Revelation, if you go back to Revelation and you look at Revelation 7, which if we all remember our counting numbers accurately, Revelation 7 is right between Revelation 6 and Revelation 8. Just thought I'd state that.
That's your interpretation.
That's my interpretation, right? I read one interpreter. He wrote this massive interpretation, 1,500 pages. His last name is Charles. I forgot his first name. Anyway, R.H. Charles. I don't know what the letters stand for. R.H. Anyway,
Really confused.
Yeah, maybe. They actually he said a lot of really helpful things, but he thought that the revelation was given to us out of order, and so he rearranged it and then made a commentary on the rearrangement. Yeah, made more sense if he rearranged it. Chapter 7. So this is an interlude vision between the opening of the first 6 seals and then the 7th seal, right? First 6 seals, chapter 6, 7th seal, chapter 8. This is in the middle. After I saw the first 6 seals being opened, I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth to prevent any wind from blowing on land or sea or any tree. They're holding back judgment. Okay. And I saw another angel coming up from the east, having the seal of the living God. And he called out in a loud voice to the 4 angels who had been given power to harm the land and the sea. Do not harm the land or the sea or the trees until we put a seal on the foreheads of the servants of our God. This is right out of Ezekiel 9. Okay, so we have a reference to Ezekiel 9 and Ezekiel 10. I mean, very clear references, right? Ezekiel 10 is Revelation 8, Ezekiel 9, very clear right here. We're going to judge the city. Put a seal on the people who are God's people. Don't judge until we put the seal. It's the same thing. And then throw the fire from the altar down on the city to indicate judgment is starting. So I don't think they're just parallel for literary reasons. I think that the same thing. I think Jerusalem is being judged. I think it's the same city being judged. Verse 4, then I heard the number of those who were sealed, 144,000 from all the tribes of Israel. Okay, so that's a significant number, 144,000, 12 times 12. It's 12 squared times 10 cubed, 12 times 12 times 1,000. And then he goes through. I'm not going to read all of this. I just want you to notice something here, that in verse 8, you have the tribe of Joseph. And in the verse 6, you have the tribe of Manasseh, which is weird. Why is that weird? Because
in the tribes that are described in they're described in the Old Testament.
Right, because Joseph is actually not a tribe.
Right.
Joseph is 2 half tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh. But Manasseh is listed here, but not Ephraim. Joseph is listed here. We're also missing Dan. So whatever this is, it is not a list of the 12 tribes. And so non-dispensational commentators have concluded that the fact that it's not a list of the 12 tribes is to indicate to us that we are to focus on the numbers, and the numbers are highly significant, being derivative of 12 and 12, so their numbers are complete, and what it basically means is God's people. And actually, if you go through and look at the second vision starting in verse 9, after this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude, that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They were wearing white robes and holding palm branches in their hands. And they cried out in a loud voice, "Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb." And then, you go on, you have the same, what is that? Sevenfold, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, sixfold, right? Praise to God. If you go, verse 13, then one of the elders asked me, "These in the white robes, who are they and where did they come from?" I answered, "Sir, you know." And he said, "These are those who have come out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Therefore, they're before the throne of God." So they've come out of this tribulation. A lot of people think, I think it's probably the majority understanding is that this vision of the innumerable multitude from every tribe, tongue, and nation who've come out of the great tribulation it's another vision of the 144,000 who are marked and sealed so that they would be preserved through the great tribulation. And so what we have there then is a picture of the church, right? Basically, in both of them, and it's not a picture of the Jewish people in the first part and a picture of the church in the second part, but that it's the same. And I'd mentioned before when we read Revelation 5 that there's this thing that happens in the Revelation where one thing becomes another thing. You see, the angel said to me, "Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah." And then I turned and looked, and it was a lamb. Look here in chapter 7. So you had hearing, then seeing, right? And what he sees is different from what he heard in Revelation 5. So chapter 7, verse, he never sees the 144,000. Verse 4, then I heard the number of those who were sealed. And then he gets a recitation of 144,000 being sealed from these tribes. And then verse 9, and then I looked, and before me was a great multitude. It's very similar to, hey, there's a lion over there. And I turned and looked, and it was a lamb. But the lion and the lamb are the same. It's just two different pictures of the same thing. So that type of thing happens more than a couple of times in the Revelation. So something to think about. And now we've got to 10:30, so I think I'm good to go more, but I don't know about you guys. 10:30 is good. So
I gotta roll.
All right. So we've gone through at least the first, Revelation 1 through chapter 8, verse 4 or 5. We're in big blocks, big pictures, and I'm happy to do more detail. The thing to remember about Revelation 7 and 8 is that they're based on Ezekiel 9 through 11, and it's very, very clear. And the thing to remember about Revelation 6 is that it's based on the Olivet Discourse and might be a repetition of it. And so, anyway, those are really important things. So I hope that's been at least thought-provoking.
Yeah.
Yes,
All right.
for sure.
All right. I'm going to stop the recording.